Welcome to Scigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Kia ora koutou, hello and welcome to another episode of Scigest. My name's Rebecca Bloomer and today I am delighted to be talking with Dr. Roger Robson-Williams, whose current role at Plant and Food is as our Chief Sustainability Officer. So, acknowledging right up front, this is potentially going to be a little bit of an unusual episode of Scigest in that it's not only a Scigest episode, it's also a prequel episode for a new podcast series that's going to be running at Plant and Food, hosted by Roger. And so what we're talking about today is, on the one hand, a little bit of a science life for me, getting to know Roger himself and his background in science, how he's come to be in the role he's in now. But we're also going to talk a little bit about what is the Chief Sustainability Officer role, what the importance of that role is for Plant and Food and what we're doing in that space. And talk a little bit with Roger about what plans he has for his forthcoming series as well. So welcome, Roger. It's really lovely to have you here today.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. Really delighted to be here and looking forward to this conversation.
I think it'll be good. And I'm really looking forward to your podcast series, incidentally. So I wanted to start, as we usually do with a Science Life for Me kind of series, talking a little bit about you as a scientist, I guess. So you started out in a science role prior to moving to New Zealand, yes?
Yeah, I moved quite quickly after my PhD from lab kind of research into more science leadership and management. And that was because I love all sorts of dimensions of science, but I saw that I was probably going to be better at the kind of broad and shallow stuff than the deep and narrow. So I quite quickly shifted into managing, in the first instance, contracted out research. So I worked for a levy organisation, a bit like the Foundation for Arable Research in New Zealand, and really enjoyed learning about the UK seed and grain industry and the science that was needed to support that. So that was my first role, and then moved to other of those sort of senior leadership positions in science in the UK.
So in terms of getting into a kind of seed and grain industry role initially, though, that implies a background in kind of agricultural research of some kind. What had you done initially?
Yeah, so most people love food and it's a basic human need.
Yes.
And I've always been interested in biology, and an obvious expression of that as a scientist is to be interested in the biology of the food system. So I don't think I ever really had any doubt that I was going to want to work in that kind of space. So yeah, the opportunity to work in the seed and grain industry came up and I took it, and that was a great start, really.
So that was in the UK. At some point after some of those roles, you moved to New Zealand. What brought you here?
So, as I've said, the food system is something I was really interested in and wanted to be part of supporting. And food production's a big part of New Zealand's identity and economy. So it's an interesting place to be involved in that. And I was really struck on early visits to New Zealand by the recognition of the role of science in supporting agriculture in a way that I hadn't really seen in the UK. So that this recognition, acknowledgement that we need science and innovation to improve the way we grow and store and transport food. And that was, enormously attractive, along with the fact that as a smaller nation with fewer degrees of separation, I could see how you could potentially have a greater positive influence in somewhere like New Zealand. So I was right back in 2000, it was my first visit. I kind of got the bug to come and work in New Zealand, and it took actually 12 years from then before the right opportunity came up. And as it happens, I've now been in New Zealand for 12 years, so I'm really, really enjoying it and delighted I made the move.
I'm kind of curious about the observation you started with there, which is the sense that New Zealand perhaps values science as part of its food system in a different way than the UK does. And I guess I'm wondering, do you mean in terms of kind of at industry level, the growers, or the wider public?
Yeah, both. So initially it was very much being struck by industry's recognition of the importance of science and innovation. But having spent time in New Zealand, I also really enjoy the fact that much of the kind of New Zealand population engages in and is exposed to aspects of food production and innovation that sits behind that country calendar news coverage in a way that certainly in the UK it's much less part of the national dialogue, what's going on in agriculture. So at all sorts of levels, it's a more growing food and feeding people is a bigger part of our national identity and narrative in New Zealand than I had experienced elsewhere, which I think is wonderful.
It's kind of nice to hear, actually, because we are often led to believe a little bit, perhaps, that it's quite a polarised narrative even here at times. But that's obviously less so the case here than what you'd observed in the UK.
I don't think I'd get into a comparison of the degree of polarisation between urban and rural in the two places, but food is such a connecting thing. It's such an important part of social life, cultural life, as well as being a basic biological need. And, most reasonable people recognise that. And anybody that's tried to grow any of their own food and veg, or even just look after a flock of chickens, will know it's not at all easy. And, to try and make a livelihood out of doing that is next level compared to growing a few of your own veggies. So, you've got to have respect for people that do make a living out of it, or
Absolutely.
try to.
Yeah, looking at the state of my veggie garden, absolutely. You mentioned it took you 12 years to find the right role to come to. What was the role that brought you here?
So the role that brought me here was at the Foundation for Arable Research as their Director of Research, which involved me at the time in lots of the discussion that was going on back then around the impacts of agriculture on fresh water. And that was a great introduction to not just the grain and seed industry in New Zealand, but the dairy industry, the beef and sheep industry, broader horticulture, a really deep immersion, because I had the opportunity to be involved in those primary sector discussions with regulators and policymakers about how we were going to approach the problem of freshwater quality impacts from agriculture. A wonderful opportunity on essentially landing in New Zealand and immediately diving into that.
Must have built you an amazing network of kind of professional connections too across a range of sectors then.
Yeah, it really was. And getting that sense of the big picture of New Zealand agriculture and some of the key players. So I really, I have a lot to thank the Foundation for Arable Research for in terms of facilitating that introduction to New Zealand, yeah.
Just stepping back for 1 second, for our listeners who may not be familiar with FAR and what they do, can you give a sort of 2-second summary of their role?
Yeah, good point. So FAR, the Foundation for Arable Research, is the peak industry body for grain and seed farmers in New Zealand. So it collects a levy from their crops and then invests that in various activities to support the industry, including research and development.
Cool. And I don't think you've mentioned, how long were you with FAR before you moved over to Plant and Food?
I was with FAR for a couple of years, and a role came up at Plant and Food, the kind of role that's a once-in-a-decade opportunity. And so it was very much a build on what I'd been doing at FAR as well. So, so I shifted across to Plant and Food 10 years ago.
Sure, and I think that must be the role that you had when I started at Plant and Food 6-ish years ago, which was as General Manager for our Sustainable Production portfolio.
Yeah, that's right. And I mentioned that it was a kind of build on the work that I've been doing at FAR, in the sense that it encompassed much of the science that's of interest to FAR, but it also covered the perennial horticulture that's such a big part of New Zealand's economy. So it was a build and very much an expansion.
Sure. So, and a kind of quick high-level summary of what the Sustainable Production portfolio work on as a whole? So
they work on techniques to enable the more sustainable production of arable and horticultural crops, everything from, fertilizer and water use through to some of the fundamental underlying crop physiology that you need to understand in order to figure out how best to manage these crops.
And More recently, you've moved into a role as the Chief Sustainability Officer for Plant and Food, which I'm really interested to hear a little bit more about, because that's a new role not just for you, but for the organisation as a whole, right?
Yeah. I've been really impressed at the science that we do to help other people be more sustainable in their businesses, and really enjoyed getting involved in that. But I was becoming increasingly concerned that there were aspects of our own operations that we perhaps weren't paying as much attention to as we should. An obvious example are carbon emissions and having a verified carbon footprint and taking actions to reduce it. That's an obvious example. Most businesses now are attending to that, and I felt that we should be. This was going back a couple of years. So I was really keen to advocate within the organisation in order for us to be authentic in our support for other people, that we made sure we were putting our own house in order. So I advocated for that and suggested that a part-time Chief Sustainability Officer is one way of catalysing that kind of action. And the organisation said, yeah, no, we agree. And so I ended up, it was a day a week initially, taking on that role alongside the General Manager of Sustainable Production.
So they seem like very complementary roles in that sense. You know, on the one hand, you're really advocating for the science that helps our industries get there, but on the other, maybe checking in on us occasionally and making sure we're able to be kind of credible role models in that space.
Yeah, and it was very complementary, but both roles have lots of scope to be able to fill, and it became more and more difficult juggling the kind of demands of both of those roles and really doing a decent job at both of them. And the CSO role, the Chief Sustainability Officer role, expanded up to 0.5 for about a year, and then we all agreed that it should become a full-time role for a period of time. And that's what I've been doing now for the last couple of years, full-time, which I've really, really enjoyed, being able to concentrate all of my time and energy on that. And that has provided the opportunity to go way beyond looking at our own operations and how we make sure we're paying attention to that, putting our own house in order, and thinking much more about what does a sustainable food system look like and how can we more effectively support some of our partners in their journeys towards sustainability.
A couple of things I'm kind of interested to talk about a little bit more. You've got a colleague who works with you in this space, and that's a joint role across a couple of CRIs at least. So we're working together with Remind Me?
Yeah. So you're talking about Stephen Wallace, and he's working across plant and food research and ag research, which is our pastoral farming equivalent sister CRI. And he's been in that 50-50 role now for a couple of years. That's become a permanent shared role, which is working really well. So for me personally, it's wonderful having the opportunity to get more insights into pastoral farming, which is obviously such a big part of New Zealand. And practically speaking, the lessons that we can learn from both organisations sharing somebody in that role. We're facing similar problems, but there are some different solutions we can take to it. It's proving to be a really, really positive collaboration on so many different levels. And again, really appreciate that ag research we're up for that experiment, which is working out really well.
That's awesome. It seems such an obvious thing to do on the one hand, but in practice, we often don't maybe work as closely with some folks as we could. And so it's awesome to see it working out well. Curious to know, and perhaps talking about how you've taken some learnings from how ag research is doing things as well, segues nicely into this. Since the inception of the CSO role, what are some of the activities, I guess, that have been undertaken within Plant and Food, and what are some of the changes you're starting to see about the way the organisation goes about its own business?
Thanks. That's a great question. And I mentioned earlier about carbon emissions and that being an obvious place to start. And so we now have a verified audited carbon footprint. We've got an emissions reduction program, which is focusing on the big areas of emissions for us, which include business travel, especially air travel, our staff commuting to and from work, and then the energy that we use on our 14 sites, the kind of static energy use. So we've got a plan to reduce those. We've got a science-based target, aligned target for a reduction in our emissions over the next few years. So that's all really good and stuff that we didn't have in place. And sitting behind that is a lot of grassroots activity on things like improved recycling, reducing the amount of waste that we have going to landfill, and those kind of grassroots initiatives, which are really important as well. So that's on a kind of an operational level, if you like. Equally exciting for me is some of the language and concepts of sustainability are really becoming part of how we talk about ourselves. And what I mean here, for example, is the concept of the planetary boundaries. So these 9 life-supporting Earth systems, including climate and biodiversity and fresh water. There are 9 of them. And if we're serious about a sustainable food system, it needs to be one that operates within those planetary boundaries. And we know we are transgressing 6 of those 9 planetary boundaries at the moment as a planet. And agriculture has a really important role to play in bringing us back from those transgressions and operating within the safe space. So a long-winded way of saying, hearing people within our organisation start to mention concepts like the planetary boundaries and thinking about the impact that our science can have in helping us operate within the safe operating space of our planet is great. So we've got the kind of grassroots stuff, which is really important. And then we've got the conceptual, how do we think about what we do and plan the science and the impact that we're trying to create? And I'm seeing change at both of those extremes, if you like.
It's really good to hear that you're getting, well, it sounds like you're getting quite strong staff buy-in for the work that you're doing then.
Yeah, yes.
Slightly hesitant, yes.
Yeah, it's a great question. So yes, and our people are almost universally, really concerned about all sorts of aspects of sustainability, and I think we're doing a better job as an organisation now of aligning our kind of organisational values to the personal values of a lot of the people that work here, which is great. The reason I chuckle is because there's this thing called the values action gap, where people will genuinely feel, for example, action on climate is important, but when it comes down to having to make some trade-off or compromise in their own life, it can be quite difficult to make that correct decision. And I think our use of air travel as a business is a good example of that. Now, we absolutely need to remain nationally and internationally connected for our science, for our interaction with customers and all that. There's no question, and air travel for the foreseeable future is going to be an important part of that. But there are going to be ways we could be smarter about using virtual tools and planning our travel to get the most value out of it. We're in that transition phase now, and that's where it can become a bit more challenging for people.
Do you think, I mean, it was kind of an unpleasant way for us to get there probably as a group, but I feel like COVID and the fact we simply couldn't travel as much as we used to kind of gave us a bit of a jump start of getting into that mindset of doing a lot more stuff in hybrid ways and a lot more remote working. And I, for example, am based in a team that's split across 4 sites, and we're getting pretty good these days at connecting virtually in all kinds of different ways. It's definitely tricky, but I would have said as an organisation we're doing a lot better than I think we probably were a year or 2 ago in terms of kind of culturally, I guess.
Yeah, the pandemic was a terrible price to pay to learn those lessons, but something possibly positive that has come out of it is that a lot of the etiquette around how you use those kind of tools and some of the social settings, that it's okay not to jump on a plane and turn up to the meeting in person if you can do that effectively remotely via Teams or Zoom or something. All of that has taken quite a big leap forward because we had to operate in that way. And one of the things that I've been really keen to do in my CSO role is capitalize on that as much as possible to really reinforce those kind of behaviors and lock that in as a new normal for how we operate. But, you know, it's a balance, and face-to-face interaction with people is super important, and we need to remain internationally relevant and connected. And it's a particular challenge for New Zealand because we're a small nation, geographically isolated. We don't have a lot of the public transport options that mainland Europe and North America have. So this is going to be an issue that we grapple with as a nation and as a science system for the foreseeable future. And unfortunately, I'm not super optimistic that there are going to be really effective technical interventions to solve this problem in the next decade or so. It's going to be a behavioural one if we are to rein in our aviation-related emissions.
And as you kind of touched on, not just our aviation-related ones, but you mentioned earlier our commuting is a big part of our organisational footprint, and some of our sites will be better served than others in terms of public transport or EV charging infrastructure or whatever. But encouraging folks to use the options available to them is one thing. The option has to be there in the first place is the other. Yeah,
you know, commuting is a really, really vexed topic because on the one hand, an organisation could say, well, we're not really responsible for how people get to work. On the other hand, you could say, well, those people wouldn't be travelling if they didn't have to come and work at your organisation. And so we took the view that we should, if you like, own the emissions associated with our people getting to work. But people have all sorts of reasons why they choose the mode of transport they choose. And you've alluded to the fact that in many cases there may be very limited options anyway. And even where public transport might be an option, there's all sorts of lifestyle reasons why that might not work for people. So I think the trick for us is to provide as many different options as we can for our people to choose from that suit their particular kind of circumstances. And that includes everything from better provision for after journey showering and bike storage through to considering, well, are there some sites where we could even have a minibus or some chartered coach that goes around? You know, there's all sorts of different solutions out there. The tricky thing for us with 14 sites dotted around the country will be there's not going to be a one size fits all. It's going to be very site specific. And it's something that Stephen and I get a lot of feedback about.
I bet.
Yeah.
I have questions myself, but perhaps not for the podcast. You alluded to, and I think you were probably a bit more excited by, if anything, seeing the kind of change in the way we think about our science connecting to some of these bigger problem questions. Have you got any kind of favourite examples you can share?
Oh, just first up, the excitement thing. It's all important. The small interventions that we all make on a day-to-day basis aggregate up to make a difference. But it's also exciting that the really big impact that an organisation like Plant and Food, or ag research for that matter, can have is through the science that we do that supports other people to be more sustainable in their businesses. So it's all important, and I'm excited about it all. In terms of impact and enabling our customers and partners to be on their journey to sustainability, it's something that it's the business we've been in for years and years, and there are all sorts of examples. I guess probably a top of mind one for me, because it relates to conversations I was having earlier this week, relate to apple production and the improvements we've been able to achieve in terms of better understanding the physiology of apple trees and how you can manage them in a way that helps them to intercept more of the sunlight that's hitting the orchard and produce better quality, higher yields of fruit with essentially less input. So that's just one example, and that's something that precedes me as CSO, so I'm absolutely not claiming any credit for that at all, but it's a nice top of mind example for me of the kind of way that science can help support more sustainable food production.
Yeah, and I think, even if you were to troll back through a few of our Scigest podcasts, there are a bunch of other examples of some really nice work that Plant and Food's been doing in that space, actually.
Yeah.
So you mentioned kind of earlier in our chat that the CSO role was kind of something that you saw a need for and advocated for, and you've since stepped into. And I'm kind of interested, I guess, in bringing it back a wee bit to the kind of classic Scigest science life for me, but perhaps more of a sustainable life for me. I'm getting a sense that your professional advocacy reflects some quite deeply held personal values as well, and I'm curious how you implement some of this stuff in your own life.
Yeah, thank you. I guess I don't see a massive separation between the personal and professional any longer, because this is an area that I'm so interested in and concerned about. And, on a practical level, obviously there's stuff that, as individuals we can choose to do to try and tread more lightly on the planet, and depending on your circumstances and resources, you've got a different range of options. And so, for us, we've got the space and to some extent the time and the resources to try growing as much of our own food as we can, and replanting a paddock in native bush and those kind of things, which aren't options open to everybody. We're lucky we've got those options, and we're trying those things. But one of the kind of unexpected benefits of that for me professionally is this greater sense of connection to the environment, and a very tangible way, a kind of dirt under your fingernails kind of way, much greater awareness of the impact of seasons and weather. And I know I alluded to this earlier, but actually just how difficult it is to grow stuff in one sense. And in fact, we don't grow stuff. Stuff grows itself. We just try and provide it some space and a bit of a helping hand from time to time. But, I've got, since taking on this Chief Sustainability Officer role, a much more profound appreciation of, just how difficult farming is. And we're dabbling in it, and it's not our livelihood, and if things go wrong there are all sorts of plan Bs. But if you're a livestock farmer and you're struggling for feed in a dry summer, the stress that must cause, or if you're an orchardist in Hawke's Bay that's just seen your orchard disappear under meters of silt. And so dabbling in trying to do some of those things on a at a home kind of scale has really helped. And one recent example, we borrowed a small tractor that had been converted to electric, and it's a really interesting outfit, Loxley Innovation, based just down the road from Lincoln here in Taitapu. And Duncan there converted this tractor to use on his own lifestyle block, and then a chap called Mike Casey, who runs a fossil fuel free orchard in central Otago, he used it for I think better part of a year, came back. Anyway, we thought we'd borrow it for a couple of weeks and see how useful it was. And the insight that I got from that, which kind of seems obvious now, but just how much more work you can do, what becomes possible when you can essentially throw energy at the problem. You can compress time by using energy. And of course, what human society or Euro-Western society has done for the last 150 years is use fossil fuels to do that. And so for me personally, on the one hand, I want to benefit from that amazing increase in work rate that you can achieve using machines and energy. But I don't want to do that at the expense of the climate, which is where something like an electrified tractor comes in. And again, I appreciate that on a lifestyle block, small tractor, that's all feasible. If you're dealing with professional scale commercial agriculture, the options to move away from diesel are very much more limited. So I'm not saying this is the solution and everybody should be doing it. I'm just saying that what I try and achieve at home on my own bit of land profoundly influences how I see the problem of producing food and doing so sustainably. And I think it's useful, and hopefully it brings some additional kind of richness to the role.
You've alluded throughout this conversation to kind of a whole series of things, I guess, that worry you a bit about how we're living on the planet. And I'm curious as someone who is deeply prone to worrying myself and knows how paralyzing that can be in terms of actually taking any kind of productive action to change things, how do you sort of stay optimistic about things?
Good question. Another good question, thank you. There are lots and lots of smart people doing really interesting things to try and solve different aspects of the polycrisis, whether it's social dimensions of sustainability or environmental or governance, come to that. So that gives me hope. And, you know, the majority of people want to do the right thing and are in some instances constrained by their kind of circumstances, be it income or time or whatever. People want to do the right thing. There are lots of smart people paying a lot of attention to what doing the right thing looks like. So that gives me real hope and cause for optimism. And seeing even just in the small kind of ecosystem that I operate within, seeing change at all sorts of levels. Again, I mentioned this earlier, from the small scale grassroots activities to the big picture thinking, what impact are we trying to create as an organisation? So that also all gives me cause for hope. And I think somebody once said that they were kind of intellectually pessimistic but chose to be optimistic. And I think it is a choice. And I'm lucky, I guess I'm essentially a somewhat optimistic glass half full type person anyway. So, but yeah, we're seeing in our own organisations and at different levels, albeit slower than I'd like to see, some positive change.
Even if slower, I guess we take the wins where we can get them. So I'm wondering, is that the sort of stuff that you're wanting to talk about in your own podcast series? I can't remember if I introduced it at the beginning. I know I mentioned it, but Roger will be hosting a kind of parallel series to Scigest called People, Planet, Food. What are you planning to cover in that?
It's a really neat segue from the optimism question you just posed. I kind of want, on one level, to provide a bit of a showcase for some of these remarkable people doing interesting things to lead us towards a more sustainable food system. That's part of what I want to do, and give them a bit of a platform. I think a lot of the people that I have in mind for the first few are friends of plant and food research and relate in different ways to the science that we do. So partners, if you like, in trying to achieve improvement. And I think it might be slightly surprising, some of the different angles that are being explored by some of these people. And working at that intersection between people, planet and food, personally, I just find fascinating, because I think people are interesting. I think food is great. And I'm rather motivated to make sure we keep the planet in a livable state. So it kind of brings together three of my favourite things.
Are you able to give us any sneaky previews into who you're going to be talking with, or would you prefer to save that for?
Yeah, I'm happy to give a sneaky preview. So we've got a couple of international visitors coming up over the next couple of months. One is the CEO of the Food Farming and Countryside Commission in the UK, a lady called Sue Pritchard, and I'm really interested in having a chat with her about the work that she's doing at this intersection in the UK, and maybe some of her observations around the differences and the similarities and the challenges that our two nations face. And another international visitor we have coming in April is a chap who was co-founder of a kind of tool that organisations can use to actually quantify how sustainable they are. So rather than just say, are we doing a bit better than we were last year, actually be able to benchmark in absolute terms. And he's got some really interesting perspectives on sustainability in business across Europe and Southeast Asia that I think will be relevant to us. So those are two that will be coming up hopefully soon.
Sounds good. And some local content as well?
Definitely, yep. And I will keep that under my hat for the time being. But
very good. We've got to save some surprises. Yeah. Nice to see that you're getting the most out of folks' air miles as well.
Absolutely, yeah. And well spotted, Rebecca.
It's a double win. I love it. I'm conscious that we've had quite a long conversation at this point and we should probably think about wrapping up. Is there anything else that you'd really like to share with our listeners before we do?
Yeah, I guess that sustainability and action on our carbon emissions, the waste we generate, the decisions we make about the stuff we buy and where we buy it from, how we spend our time, all these things they're kind of challenging and complicated and speak to people's kind of core values and beliefs. And I just want to acknowledge that it is difficult and challenging space, and we are all in different ways likely to need to start to make some different decisions and change our behaviour, and that's not kind of easy. And I think I'd like to finish off just by reflecting on something that Rod Carr alluded to earlier. I was going to say earlier this year, actually last year. He's the chair of the Climate Change Commission in New Zealand, and he just made the observation that the responsibility to make climate-wise decisions weighs particularly heavily on those of us that have the resources to make the right decisions. And I think you just need to acknowledge that not everybody does have those resources, but those of us that do need to really be stepping up and making good choices.
It's really nice to hear that so clearly acknowledged. I know it's something we've talked a little bit about among ourselves as an institute. We're all at different stages and differently resourced to kind of go on that journey with you. But it's great to have someone who's kind of advocating for it at an organisational level and, willing to share the kind of examples he's setting in his own life as well. It's been a really fascinating chat, Roger. Thank you so much for your time, and really looking forward to your own series. I look forward to listening to that one. Thank you so much also to you, our listeners, for tuning in to another episode of Scigest. I should mention we do really appreciate when you subscribe, rate and review our podcasts, because it really does help to boost our reach and get our science stories out more widely than just to our regular listeners. So appreciate if you can do that as well. Mā te wā.